So, my reason for wanting to do this play, The Christians, is because I grew up going to a giant megachurch, just like the one in the play. We had a huge sanctuary and a ton of pastors and a giant congregation, and so it really reminded me of my experiences growing up going to that church. And we actually had a pastor that really reminds me of Pastor Paul. And unfortunately, due to some controversy, he was let go by the Board of Elders, just like Pastor Paul was in the play. And that's kind of why I wanted to do this, because I could relate to it so heavily. And as far as how I want my audience to respond to this production goes, I really want them to experience the feeling of this crisis in faith that Pastor Paul is having, and I want them to experience his guilt and his grief at his loss of authority and loss of the love of his congregation and the faith that they had in him. Because in my mind, this is the story of a man who is slowly broken down by other people's beliefs and other people's choices, but by his own responsibilities. His responsibilities to his job, to his congregation, and to his family. So this is also where my main theme of compassion versus convention comes into play. I believe that Pastor Paul represents the compassion side, and Associate Pastor Joshua, Elder Jay, Pastor Paul's wife Elizabeth, Congregant Jenny, and everybody who's left the church represent the convention side. So I believe that Pastor Paul represents the compassion side of the argument because of his story that he told at the beginning of the play during his sermon about the boy who saved his sister from the fire and ended up dying himself. So to me, the story is truly rooted in compassion. I mean, the boy in the story did the most compassionate thing you could do, which is giving your life for someone else's. And because he makes the discovery that he truly believes there is no hell because of this story that he heard, I think that his beliefs are rooted in compassion. Compassion for his congregation, for his family, for Associate Pastor Joshua, for people he doesn't even know. And I want the audience to realize this, because that makes the ending of the play even more bitter, even more disheartening, because you know that he was doing the right thing. You know that he had good intentions and that he really genuinely just wanted the best for his congregation and wanted them to believe in the same compassion that he experienced. So the character arcs that I am most concerned about for this production are Pastor Paul's and Associate Pastor Joshua's, because in my mind, they run perpendicular to each other. Rather than running parallel and having very similar character arcs, they seem to go in opposite directions, and I'll get into this a little bit further in a minute. Pastor Paul begins his story by giving his controversial sermon. He starts the play with all of the power in the church. He's the head pastor. He has the love and respect of his congregation, of his family, of the board of elders, of Associate Pastor Joshua. And then when he does give his controversial sermon, he begins the process of losing all of that. And that is why I believe their character arcs run in opposite directions to each other, because Associate Pastor Joshua ends the play by having all of the love and respect of the congregation that Pastor Paul begins the play with. This is not just because he's offered Pastor Paul's job, but also because of all of the members of the congregation that have left to join his church. And we really see these members of the congregation represented in Congregant Jenny. So when she makes the decision to leave, saying, okay, I guess I'm going to go then, we see first her leave the stage, and then we see the music director leave the stage, the choir or band leave the stage, and then it is only Pastor Paul and his wife Elizabeth left. And to me, this is really representative of this enormous loss in power that he experiences. I mean, the only person left on stage that could even be considered as being on his side is his wife, and even she can't fully get behind his new beliefs. And then in the next scene, when Pastor Paul meets with Associate Pastor Joshua, and they discuss the Board of Elders offering the position of head pastor to Brother Joshua, Pastor Paul experiences another enormous loss in power because he discovers that he is in fact going to lose his position as head pastor to Brother Joshua, the man who kind of began all of this by voicing his dissent and leading the members of the congregation away from Pastor Paul and towards himself. And then in the final scene of the play, which is between Pastor Paul and his wife Elizabeth, we see his final plea, his final grasp at any semblance of respect and power that he may have once had. He begs his wife to stay. And I find the final line of the play really fascinating because it's really unclear as to what exactly he's referring to. He says it will make more sense later. And we're not sure what exactly it is he's talking about, if he means his belief that there is no hell, or their relationship, or his loss of his position as head pastor. We're not entirely sure, but it could mean all or none of those things. And the final straw, really, for both characters is the Board of Elders offering Pastor Paul's position as head pastor to Brother Joshua. For Brother Joshua, it is his final scene on the stage, and it's the scene in which he reveals to Pastor Paul why he believes there is a hell. He reveals to Pastor Paul that he saw his mother fall into hell as she died, and he held her hand as she passed away and saw in her eyes as she descended into hell and the fear that she had. And this is a really powerful moment for both characters. For Pastor Paul, because he realizes that he may be wrong. It really instills a sense of doubt in him, which is also something that I want the audience to realize and that I really want them to experience. And for Brother Joshua, it is his final blow. It is his final grasp at power. He finally has exactly what he wanted, and he doesn't need any help from the church. He tells Pastor Paul that he isn't going to accept the position based on likely moral principles, but also based on the fact that he doesn't need their help anymore. He has his own church with all of these members of his old congregation. He doesn't need any help from a failing, dying church anymore. As far as my passion for this play goes, I really want to represent not only my own experiences growing up in an evangelical megachurch, but other people's as well, because I believe that they are incredibly, incredibly similar. I want the audience to really be able to identify not only with the storytelling and the environmental aspects of this play, but with the characters themselves, because in my mind, that is the most important part. I also know that everyone has either said or done something that they've regretted and that they wish they hadn't done. And I want the audience to experience the guilt and the pain associated with what happens when this regret snowballs into a giant, uncontrollable situation the way it does in the play. And I also know that everybody at one point or another has to have stood up for themselves or someone they loved, or a belief that they've had, and had other people not react so well to it. And I would really want my cast and my designers and the audience especially to be able to identify with this aspect of it as well, because it started with something so simple as Pastor Paul standing up for his new beliefs and wanting to impart this compassion upon his congregation. But instead of having the outcome that he wanted it to, it became this uncontrollable situation. I would choose to produce this play in a proscenium stage, mostly because a proscenium stage is about as close as you can get to the layout and the environment of a 21st century megachurch. Now, the script gives you the option to either have a large choir, it does say the bigger the better, or you can have a band. And in my experience, most large churches will have a band with a guitarist and a worship pastor and someone playing a drum kit, and honestly, just as many instruments as they can find. Sometimes they'll even have a brass section. And so that's something that I would want to incorporate. And in my research, I have found, and I'm not quite sure why this is, but most large churches will use blues and purples in their lighting. So that's also something I would want to incorporate into my design. And as far as sets go, the play is very specific. It says it takes place, quote, in a church, a real big church, and what we see is the stage, raised and carpeted, in the center a podium, and further upstage hanging a cross. Surrounding potted plants, above a screen for projections, off to the side 2 or 3 chairs in a row, chairs for the associate pastors, and off to the other side an electric church organ and organist. The playwright is also very particular about sound. He says, quote, and there are microphones and stands, enough for everyone in the play, because everyone will always speak on mics, just the way pastors do, or just the way congregants do when they testify.
I would also want to be very particular about the costuming, especially. Mostly the women's costumes, because modesty and humility are such huge values for women in evangelical churches that I would want the costume designer to perhaps produce something similar to these images. So, as far as projections go, I would want to work very closely with my designers about the images we used, because the script is very particular about the images which are projected on the screen just after Pastor Paul finishes delivering his sermon. So, I would want to work with my designers to find images we believe to be appropriate and, more importantly, accurate to the ones used in churches today. I would also like to have the words to each of the hymns the band plays superimposed over similar imagery as they play the songs. I found that this is really common in large churches, as it is impractical for the church to produce a hymnal for each member of the congregation. And this concludes my project. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.